Good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, so we're going to get started. So thank you all for coming. My name is Chloe Adcock, and I am the coordinator for this year's International Development Roundtable series. The Development Roundtable is a high-profile speaker series where leaders and scholars within the international development sphere address our students, faculty, and the wider community on trends and challenges that are shaping the field. On behalf of everyone in the IDPs community, I would like to welcome you all today to our final roundtable series of the semester with our esteemed guest, Mr. Xavier Devictor. Xavier Devictor is the practice manager for the Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Group in the World Bank, and in that role, he leads work on forced displacement as a development challenge. Prior to this role, he was the country manager for Poland and the Baltic countries. Mr. Devictor has also led World Bank programs in a range of fragile and conflict-affected countries, including Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, and the Balkans. Earlier in his career, he managed humanitarian programs for the UN Refugee Agency in the former Yugoslavia. Today, Mr. Devictor will be talking about development approaches to refugee crises. Historically, aid for refugees has been strictly treated as a humanitarian issue, but with the protracted nature of many refugee situations, development actors are becoming increasingly involved. Mr. Devictor will talk about how the development approach is different, as well as what the World Bank is doing to engage in this area. Without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Mr. Devictor so we can get started.
Thank you very much. First, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you very much for the department. Thank you to Chloe for all the preparatory work. What I wanted to talk about today is really this question of how can we better manage the issue of forced displacement. But I'd like to start by saying that this is about people. Right? This is not about abstract concepts. This is about people. This is about people who live in very, very difficult circumstances, and this is about trying to find the best possible ways to help and support them. So the question that we asked ourselves a few years ago is that there seems to be a consensus that humanitarian assistance can be very helpful, that the current system has now reached its limits, and that we need an engagement by development actors. The question, though, is what does that actually mean? Are we just doing humanitarian aid by another name? Are we just doing income generation in terms of livelihood, education in terms of skills instead of skills development? Or are we doing something which is fundamentally different? Right? And so that's what I wanted to discuss a little bit today. What exactly are we doing and how different is it from humanitarian assistance? What I'd like to do is really to start with the scope of the crisis, right? We all know the numbers. We're talking about 75-ish million plus who live in forced displacement, the largest refugee crisis since World War II. You see the trend lines, they're only going up. And that fuels a sense of crisis. And I assume that in this room, some of us probably have liberal beliefs, others have conservative beliefs. We probably all agree that 75 million plus people is a lot of people, right? So as we look at these numbers, what I'd like to do is to spend a few moments to break them down. The first question is, how solid are these numbers? So let me give you an example. How many refugees were there in Norway at the end of 2013? The answer is 18,000, according to the European Statistical Agency. 46,000, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. 132,000, according to Norwegian statistics. So depending on who you ask, you go from 1 to 6. We're talking about Norway, a country at peace, with stable institutions, with solid technical capacity. So just to flag the fact that while these numbers are mentioned with a lot of assertiveness, one has to keep in mind it's extremely difficult to count refugees. It's extremely difficult to count how many people have been displaced or are displaced today in Syria for all the good reasons that you can imagine. So that's the first point. The second point is not all these people are refugees. Mind you, most are what's called internally displaced persons. So they are people who have actually moved in their own country and who tend to stay in their own country because of conflict and violence, right? So most of these people have not crossed the border, will most likely not cross the border anytime soon. The number of refugees itself is in the range of 25 million. 25 million is still a large number, right? But the 25 million includes about 5 million Palestinian refugees. And the Palestinian refugees are people who have been displaced by the conflict in 1948 or 1967, or their descendants, right? So the number of Palestinian refugees that you see from the blue line grows year after year because it is essentially a measure of demographic growth, right? The number of refugees themselves, so you have, once again, in total, 22-ish million non-Palestinian refugees. That includes about 17 million in non-OECD countries, right, in poor countries. Out of these 17 million, about 12 million have been in displacement for more than 5 years. So these are people who have stabilized in situations that are sometimes very unfortunate, but still have stabilized in the environment where they live, right? So I just wanted to flag these numbers just to, I think, try to give a sense that this is not a problem that is beyond what the international community can manage. I think it's Mr. Miliband from IRC who was saying this is a problem that we as an international community should be able to manage if we organize ourselves properly, right? We're talking about the equivalent of a large city in the world. We're talking about numbers that are far, far below the numbers of children who do not have access to school, far, far below the numbers of children who are stunted, far, far below the number of people who do not have access to clean water, right? So we're talking about a problem that is very, very concentrated in some parts of the world that obviously has a very significant political dimension, but that is not beyond what the international community could possibly deal with, right? Very, very different from other big issues like, say, climate change, right, which require much more fundamental change in the way our economies and our societies are organized. The other point I wanted to make is really to emphasize the distinction between economic migration and forced displacement, right? So in international law, and without getting into too many details, fundamentally refugees, because of the 1951 convention, cannot be sent back to their country of origin against their will. Economic migrants obviously do not have the same level of protection, right? That's international law. But I think there have been lots of questions about, aren't these the same people? Is there really a difference, right? And I just wanted to go and just very briefly talk about these 4 graphs, right? So refugees are people who seek safety. Refugees are people who flee conflict, violence, persecution, political oppression, right? They essentially feel that their life is at risk and they're trying to move to a place where their life is not going to be at risk. Economic migrants are people like me. They're people who were born in a country and feel they may have better economic opportunities somewhere else, or a different life somewhere else, and actually change country. So there have been discussions about, how real is this difference? After all, if Syrians are leaving Syria, isn't it also because they find that now they may be able to access economic opportunities in Turkey, Germany, or wherever? So I just wanted to draw your attention to this graph, right? So the blue line is the number of deaths by week in the conflict in Syria. The red line is the number of refugees leaving Syria by week, right? And you see that the 2 graphs are frankly almost identical, right? Now, obviously, people who are very strong on statistics here would say this is not necessarily a proof of causality, but let's agree that it looks pretty much like a proof of causality, right? The other point I wanted to mention is economic migrants are looking for a job. So it tends to be people who can work. They tend to be adults, right? Typically young adults. Refugees are people who are looking for security. So it tends to be the sort of people we want to protect, our children, our elderly, the weak members of our community, right? And indeed, if you look at it, economic migrants are over 75% young adults. Refugees are about 50% children. Right? So very, very different demographic profile. And I think it's important in terms of both emphasizing that there's a difference, but it's obviously very different when it comes to, so what do we do for these people, right? Most economic migrants go to places where they feel they're going to find a job. So they tend to cross multiple borders, right? So 2/3 of economic migrants cross multiple borders. And among those who cross only one border, you obviously have the Mexicans coming to the US, and you have a lot of people living in the former Soviet republics going to Russia, right? By distinction, refugees just go to the safest possible place, right? So most of them cross only one border, and actually most of them get stuck very close to the border, right? So the South Sudanese go to Uganda, but actually they stay in northern Uganda, about 20 miles away from the border, right? So very different movement patterns of movement, but also, and this also has huge implications in terms of the type of support that these people need and the type of opportunities they can access, right? If you move from a poor country to a wealthier country, you can actually find a job. If you move from a poor country to the border area in another poor countries, there may just not be that many jobs in this area. And then finally, the graph which I find the most depressing is looking at the labor force participation of refugees versus economic migrants in the EU by year of residence. So essentially what it says is that it takes about 20 years for refugees to reach the level of labor force participation of economic migrants. Now we can have a lengthy discussion about why this is the case, but I think the key point is if you put people on the same starting blocks and it takes some people 20 years to catch up with the others, they're different, right? And I think it's very important because obviously you hear a lot about there are blurred lines, this is complicated, these people are all the same. The fundamental issue is refugees do have international protection under international law, and any blurring of the line is likely to reduce this international protection, right? And in view of the differences, I think it's very difficult to argue that these are the same people. Okay, last point. Most of these people are in low and middle income countries. Contrary to popular beliefs, they do not live in camps. They live outside of camps. And about 12 million, as I said earlier, have been in exile for more than 5 years. So it's no longer a kind of short-term condition in your life, short-term experience in your life. It becomes something very, very protracted, which once again is a key characteristic of the current situation. I've said this is a problem that's manageable, or that should be manageable. I've also said, and clearly we cannot manage it, right? So the question is, why is the current model in crisis, right? Several things. The first thing is, if you look at the origin of refugees, and you calculate the proportion of refugees, you realize that the same 10 conflicts that have caused anywhere between 55 and whatever, 70-ish% of forced displacement every year since 1991, since the end of the Cold War, right? Now remember, most refugees cross only one border, right? So if you're an Afghan, most people are in Pakistan or in Iran. If you're Somali, most people are in Ethiopia or in Kenya, right? If you're South Sudanese, you're talking about Uganda, Ethiopia, and a little bit of Kenya, right? So it's the same 10 conflicts that have caused the majority of displacement every year, year in, year out. And therefore, it's probably the same 15-ish countries that are receiving most refugees every year, year in, year out, right? And obviously, these countries are starting to say the 1951 Convention on Refugees was talking about burden sharing, was talking about fair sharing of the responsibility of hosting refugees. That doesn't sound to us very fair if it is the same 15 countries every year since 1991. So these countries are showing a little bit of impatience with the way the international system works. The cost of humanitarian assistance, or the funding of humanitarian assistance, has gone from about 8 billion in 2000 to about 28 billion in 2015. Obviously, it's a huge trend line. The question is, how sustainable is it? But the other point, which is very interesting, is that 90% of this assistance goes to crises that have lasted more than 3 years. And 2/3 goes to crises that have lasted more than 8 years. So we essentially have an instrument, humanitarian assistance, which is aimed at dealing with short-term crises, short-term problems. And we use it to deal with crises that are lasting more than 8 years, right? Think about a health system where you treat chronic diseases in the emergency room, right? That's what we're doing. Not effective, extremely costly, and at the end of the day, not very good for the patient. So there's a window of opportunity. That's a plus side, right? Which is that the international community has adopted last December the Global Compact for Refugees, which really provides key principles for a different approach. And a number of host countries are considering a new approach because they realize that this is not a problem for the international community that plays out on their territory. It's a problem for them that the international community can help address. Let me say a few words about so what, right? How could we manage this better? And especially, how can organizations like the World Bank make a contribution that can complement what's happening now and can help strengthen the international response? So the first point I wanted to make is when we think of a development response to forced displacement, first question is why? Why should we as a development institution be interested in forced displacement, right? We're about poverty reduction. The answer is because poverty is increasingly concentrated in some pockets of population. Poverty is increasingly concentrated in certain groups, in certain countries, in certain regions. And unless we want to, if we seriously want to reduce extreme poverty globally, we have to work on these pockets. We have to work on these populations. We have to work on these regions, right? So for us, as a development institution, the point is not so much to focus on displacement because people are displaced. The point is to focus on displacement because people are poor or extremely vulnerable to poverty, right? We also recognize that development is only one piece in a much bigger puzzle, and that none of these issues will be resolved without a security response, a diplomatic response, a humanitarian component, right? So the question is not so much substitution, but it's much more about how do we work with all these actors to be part of something that's bigger than what exists today, right? And that requires us to focus on our competitive advantage, right? Which is what we call the medium-term socioeconomic dimension of the crisis. Medium-term means not short-term. We're not fit for emergency responses. Socioeconomic means not so much about legal rights and legal protection, right? Not because it's not important, but because other agencies are equipped to do it much better than what we could do, right? So once again, it's an issue of trying to complement what others are doing by focusing on what we feel we are better equipped to do and working very closely to those who can work on the other dimensions of the crisis, right? And finally, we want to help both refugees and IDPs, but also the host communities, right? Now, let me go one step further. So I said we're interested in people who have been displaced, or in supporting people who are displaced because they're poor. But the question is, well, we do have poverty reduction program. Why would we need a refugee program? After all, if they're poor, they can just take advantage of the poverty reduction program, and we may not need a refugee program. But the answer to that is because these people are poor in a different way, right? In many cases, these people are poor in a very, very different way. They have lost all their assets. They've undergone very traumatic experiences, right? And this already fundamentally makes them in a different, at a different starting point than many of the people living around them. But then when they arrive in the place of asylum, in the place where they seek refuge, they very often have limited rights. In some countries, they don't have the right to work. In some countries, children do not have the right to go to school. I'm not talking about the ability or the possibility, I'm talking about the right to go to school, right? In many cases, even if they have the right to work, they live in lagging regions. They live in places where there may not be a job, right? So the number is about 70% of refugees live in countries that are faring less well than global average on economic growth. And in these countries, 70% of them live in regions that are faring less well than national average, right? So you're living in the poor region of a poor country. Even if you have the right to work, even if you have great skills, it's going to be tough, right? And they have a very short planning horizon. I just wanted to, mention one anecdote on this, which is in a very moving report by Human Rights Watch of a few years ago, right? So that's about Syrians who are in Turkey. Now, Syrians who are in Turkey, the Turks have been extremely open to the Syrians. And Syrians who are in Turkey can send their kids to Arabic schools, Arabic language schools, in places where there are enough of them to justify that there's a school, right? Otherwise, they can send their children to Turkish-speaking school. And so you had this interview of parents who said, well, there was no Arabic-speaking school close to my place. My kids could have gone to the Turkish-speaking school, but they don't speak Turkish. And so it would take them 1 year to learn Turkish. And since we're going to go back anyway, that's not the point. Let them skip school for a year. That was 6 years ago, right? So the lack of planning horizon, the fact that you have a very short planning horizon makes you make decisions that in hindsight are actually the wrong decisions. And so we see our role as trying to help people offset these specific vulnerabilities, both while they are in exile, but also when they come back, right? Think about all the awful stories you've read about women being abused along the way. Bringing this person back to their country of origin is not going to erase this experience, right? So I think when we're talking about supporting these people, it's not only the issue of displacement, it's also all the issue of all these specific vulnerabilities, all these life-changing negative experiences, and how we can help people overcome or actually mitigate them. When it comes to host communities, a host community is typically a developing community, as I said, 70% lagging regions in 70% lagging countries, right? They were facing their own problem, and then suddenly you have a large inflow of people. Now, obviously, that changes the environment in which these people live. Think about the Rohingyas arriving in the Cox's Bazar region in Bangladesh. About 1 million Rohingya, about 2-3 million people living in Cox's Bazar. You're talking about suddenly bringing in 1/3 of the population extra, right? Now, it has all sorts of consequences, right? All sorts of dimensions. And the outcome will largely depend on how the government reacts and what kind of response we bring, right? But I think from a development perspective, the idea is really to help these communities go back on the path to sustainable development. And last thing, which is that when you think about development, I'm obviously speaking to an international development class, so I have to be very careful about what I'm saying, but no country has developed with projects, right? Countries have developed because they have good policies and good institutions. And so when we look at the refugee, the forced displacement issue, our focus is on trying to improve the policy environment and the institutional environment, and obviously the projects are a mean to that end, right? Which is once again fairly different from let's build a few schools and organize a few training programs for a few refugee youth. This is the last long slide. After that, I promise I can go very fast. I think when we looked at the situation, we essentially saw, three different blocks, right? So before the crisis, most people do not leave their homes overnight, right? Most people weigh the pros and the cons. If I stay, I risk being killed. If I go, I jump into the unknown. I'll probably be very poor. I may actually be killed along the way. These are very, very difficult decisions, right? So most people try to stay for as long as they can before they actually go, right? And it's a very, very complex. It's a very, very complex decision. But as a result, if you look at the beginning of the war and the time of the largest outflow of refugees, you typically have about a year and a half, right? In many cases, at least a few months, and on average, about a year and a half. Now, of course, there are exceptions. Think about the Rwandan genocide, think about the Kosovo events in 1999. But in most cases, refugees and IDP flows can in a way be forecasted. If we asked here, in your judgment, what are the countries from which refugees could go out in the next 3-4 years? I'm sure we would probably all agree on, a set of 5, 6, 7 countries, right? Now, I'm underlining this because what if we could prepare? Think about it, right? Germany, faced with a very, very large inflow of refugees in August 2015, was frankly overwhelmed, right? And it took them years to be able to recover from this being overwhelmed. Yet, had they had 6 months to prepare, we all know that they would have been able to actually cope with the situation in a much better manner, right? Now, if you are a country that is, if you take Chad, so over the last 30 years, there were 23 years during which Chad received refugees from the north, the south, the east, the west, you name it, they have it, right? If you look at the map, they're not surrounded only by stable countries, right? So should we wait until people cross the border and deal with it as an emergency? Or could we think of it the way we think about natural disaster, the same way we think about drought, the same way we think about banking sector crisis, right? Things that we hope will never happen, but that we know may happen, and that if we are prepared for them, can be much better managed, right? I think during the crisis, so the point I wanted to make is maybe on the host communities, Lebanon and Jordan as the outlier. Lebanon and Jordan have a number of refugees compared to the national population, which is in double digits, right? So these are the outliers, and in these two countries, the sheer number of refugees raises fundamental issues, right? Everywhere else, you're talking about less than 3% of population. In most cases, less than 1% of population. And think about the fact that in a number of these countries, you're talking about countries that have a demographic growth of 2% a year, right? Now, I'm not suggesting it's easy, but I'm suggesting that the impacts, the economic and social impacts, tend to be very local. The macroeconomic impact at the national level tend to be very difficult to notice, right? The local impact, I was mentioning Cox's Bazar region in Bangladesh, is obviously far more difficult to deal with, right? And in many cases, it's a combination of several things, right? Of exacerbating challenges that existed before, be it in terms of social tensions, be it in terms of jobs, be it in terms of a lack of infrastructure and so on. There's a huge distributional impact, right? So there's all this talk about whether refugees are stealing jobs or whether they're creating jobs, whether they are a burden or whether they are an opportunity. The reality is it's a bit of both, right? You have a large influx of people who typically are not very skilled or cannot use their skills because of the environment where they are. If you were unskilled labor in the informal market, there's going to be a lot of pressure. If, on the other hand, you were a skilled laborer in the formal market, you have a much larger market, right? You have a much expanded clientele for whatever it is that you produce, right? If you were renting a house to live in, well, prices are going to go up. If, on the other hand, you are a landlord and you are owning a house that you're renting to other people, well, prices are going to go up, right? So the issue is not so much about the net impact, but it's about the distributional impact and who is actually going to be negatively affected and who is going to be positively affected and what kind of policy you put in place to make sure that you support those that are negatively affected. And then obviously strained capacities in the sense that if you have very large numbers of people coming somewhere, you will need more hospital beds, you will need more space in your schools and so on, right? On the displaced people, I mean, I talked about, the catastrophic losses, the trauma, the very, very difficult environment. I think from our perspective, it's really about jobs. It's about education. Remember, 50% of refugees are kids. And it's about gender. And gender just for a very simple reason, which is that it's very difficult to imagine a harsher condition than the condition of a woman who lives under a tent, right? And one point on education, and just for as an anecdote, there's a very interesting article about people who are forcibly displaced in Poland after World War II. So after World War II, as you know, Poland was moved to the west. The people who lived in the parts that the Soviet Union took were moved to the parts that Poland took from the Germans, right? What's very interesting, 2 generations later, the descendants of the displaced people fare much better in school than their peers, right? They have the equivalent of a year and a half of increased schooling. And this, the explanation that people propose for that is that people who are displaced by force realize that the only asset that you cannot take away from them is education, right? And therefore, they invest as a family, as a group, much more into the education of their offspring. Think about the Palestinians, right? That's very much also the experience about trying to really give your kids assets that cannot be taken away. So an investment in education is also an investment that can have very, very large payoffs. In terms of solutions, so solutions are often seen in legal terms. A solution for a refugee crisis is you go back under the protection of a state. So it can be either you return to your country of origin, you integrate, you get naturalized where you are, or you get resettled, typically to a large OECD country. I think from our perspective, it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? And as I said earlier, someone who's gone through very, very traumatic experiences, even if he or she can regain a passport, will probably still have a few things to deal with before being able to go on with their lives. Some people returned, others don't. I think what's very also important is to get away from this thinking that people are attached with an elastic band to the place where they were born. You stretch the elastic band and eventually it goes back. The reality is very different. People make a movement. In some cases, people would have moved anyway, right? You're talking about urbanization under duress, right? But also in many places, people find alternative solutions. So you have split families. You have people who live a little bit here, a little bit there. You have people who integrate informally. You have people who try to move between different places, right? So I think it's kind of important as we think about this problem to think beyond the kind of I go, I return, right? In many cases, people go, return. They go again, they return again. They go again, they return again, right? And so the sort of solutions we need to think about have to go a little bit beyond the simplistic, let them all go home, right? Just because it's not that simple for a lot of people. So I mentioned this, what can we do? What can we do based on this analysis, right? This is essentially a restructuring of earlier slides. Let me just say a few words about the way we at the bank are trying to operationalize all this, right? So essentially, the fundamental, and I'm sorry, this is going to be a bit more technical, but I was told that some of you may have an interest, so let me try to be slightly more technical. An organization like the World Bank works with countries, right? So we lend to countries, we give money to countries. And the issue is, these people are foreigners, right? So no, very few countries are interested in borrowing for foreigners. And within the context of a set envelope of aid, very few countries are interested in using this money for foreigners, right? For all the obvious reasons you can think of, right? So we have a mismatch in a way between our country-based financing model and the fact that refugees do not live in their country. And so what we've done is that we've developed 2 instruments, one for the middle-income countries, which was the Global Concessional Financing Facility, and the other one for low-income countries, which is the IDA 18 refugee sub-window, right? So just in a few words, middle-income countries, think about Lebanon, Jordan, Colombia. Global Concessional Financing Facility is essentially a big trust fund of grant money that we can use to buy down the interest rates on IBRD loans, right? So essentially the country borrows, but the trust fund is used to pay the interest rate. The IDA 18 refugee sub-window for low-income countries, think about many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The idea is the country still receives its allocation, but then it can receive extra resources over and above its allocation for projects that benefit refugees and host communities. So you no longer have to choose between your kids and the refugee kids. You do your kids, and then you can get extra money for the refugee kids, right? I think what's really interesting in these instruments is a criteria to access them, right? So to access them, you need to have three things. One, a quantitative criteria, but the other two are somewhat more interesting. The first one is you need to have an adequate production framework, right? That means we at the bank are going to look at whether the production frameworks, the legal protections that are provided to refugees are adequate. Now, we're not very well equipped to judge that, so we're going to turn to our friends, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and we're going to ask them to assess that. And on this basis, we're going to make our decision as to whether or not it is adequate or not. And obviously, this is very powerful because it also means that if the refugee protection framework becomes inadequate, then we will have to pull out, right? Which creates incentives. The other criteria, which is, I think, quite interesting, is the fact that we are asking the government for their strategy. So this is your problem. We're happy to help. How can we help? What do you plan to do, and how can we help? Which is very much part of this shift of a model from a problem for the international communities that plays out on the territory of a country to a problem that the country has to manage and that we can help with, right? And in a number of cases, this has actually opened the door to having a real discussion with the countries about how can we help, right? What do you plan to do with these people? How can we actually help you do with these people, right? And obviously, we expect this strategy to be consistent with the objective of this instrument, which are to mitigate the shock, to create socioeconomic opportunities, to facilitate solutions, and to strengthen preparedness. Right? I think I've talked about some of these points. The part that I wanted to really mention is the fact that as we engage and as we in this area and as we work on this issue, we are trying to work in very, very close partnership with UNHCR, so the UN High Commissioner of Refugees. Once again, is this notion of complementarity, right? They're very good at emergency relief. They obviously have a mandate on legal protection. We're probably not too bad at medium-term economic development, right? You can see the complementarity of mandate and the need for us to actually support each other. So in practice, these are the countries in which we are involved. I'm sure you can recognize them. But as you see, it's a lot of Africa, Middle East, Bangladesh, Pakistan, then more recently, the outcome of the Venezuela crisis. If you look at all these programs, so they are all developed, bottom up. But if you look at them, there are some themes that come quite often. The first one is really this point that I mentioned earlier, which is to shift from crisis response, people have crossed the border, we have to respond, to some more risk management, right? If you're certain countries, if you just look, I'm not going to give names because I understand we're recorded, but if you look at the map, you know your neighbors are what they are, you may experience unfortunate events, and therefore, how can you actually try to develop an approach that has a bit more elasticity so that these problems can be better managed, right? Not only supporting refugees, but also supporting host communities. Because at the end of the day, you can do whatever you want for the refugees. If the host communities in which they live, if the region in which they live is not growing economically, there will be very, very few opportunities. Trying to encourage countries to move towards a degree of socioeconomic inclusion while keeping in mind that these are highly political issues, that there are a number of factors that have very little to do with economics that are very, very important for the countries as they manage this situation, and that therefore we have to take into account the specificities of each context and what's reasonable and what's less and what's just not possible. And then also trying to look not only at the country level, but at the regional level, right? So there's IGAD, which, as you know, is the East African regional organization that has actually been very strong on trying to promote regional approaches, consistency between the response in the education sector across countries. And that tends to work very well because obviously this is leaders influencing fellow leaders, right? This is not an international agency telling you what to do. This is your neighbors telling you what they're doing. And in terms of the sort of sector that we're engaged in, so jobs, education, gender, health, what we call area-based development, which is the local development, social protection, the sort of things where we need to engage in because we are active in this area. Refugee policies. What's a good refugee policy, right? How do we measure it? All this notion of how do we best work with humanitarians. And then some very non-traditional things, right? I mentioned the fact that a lot of refugees have undergone very traumatic experiences. Well, how do we deal with that, right? We're very, very far away from your traditional World Bank program. So maybe I should stop here. I'd open for questions. Thank you so much. I was told 30 to 40 minutes. I'm 2 minutes late. I apologize.
Does this work? Okay. So before you ask your question, please state your name and your affiliation. Make sure your question is a question, and yes, and I will pass the mic. So you can. Would you like to call if you will?
No, please go ahead. Oh, you want me to call? Okay, you had your hand first.
Hi, my name is Jonah Gold. I'm a second-year IDEV student here. The past 6 months, I've been interning at a place called the Refugee Investment Network, and they're trying to kind of mobilize impact investors to invest in businesses which are either owned or support these communities. We've focused on the kind of enabling environment, some of the stuff that you were talking about. I was wondering if you could speak to whether you feel like the Jordan Compact provides a model for the ways that we can kind of incentivize better policies and regulations, and whether that's something the World Bank is looking to support.
Should we take 4 or 5 questions and then? So to the end. Yeah.
Hi, Bridget. My question is, I've seen that you've made mention of trauma and at the very end, psychosocial issues. Do you think that much of that has been supported in the past? And is there a specific agenda to increase that kind of support?
Thank you. You had a hand over there. Yeah. So 2% on this row, and then I try to respond.
Hi, I'm Will, first-year ERU student. My question is, you mentioned the preparation for crises, and with regards to climate change and the potential impacts and the catastrophic impacts, does the existing framework have the capacity to deal with the potential, cities, nations, even regions of migrant refugees as a result of climate change? And if not, are there conversations that's starting to talk about these events? Thank you.
Yeah. And then I'll try to respond.
Thanks so much. Anna Nicole from the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. We've been eagerly awaiting the UNHCR World Bank Joint Data Center, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to if you anticipate that there's going to be any complementarities between the Joint Data Center's work and the Refugee Subwindow and the GCFF, or how those would interrelate and build off of each other.
Okay, so these are all fairly specific questions. So let me maybe take them one by one. So first, on the enabling environment for business. So I don't have the number on the top of my head, but I believe the statistic is that if you look at the 15 largest refugee hosting countries, 12 of them, so you know that the World Bank is publishing these doing business indicators that essentially try to rank countries based on their business environment, right? And I think if you look at the 15 largest refugee hosting countries, it's 2/3 or 3/4 that are essentially in the bottom third of the doing business indicator, right? So you're talking about countries that don't have a great business environment to start with. And moreover, once again, you're not talking about, I don't want to name any country, but you're not talking about the capital, right? You're talking about the boonies. You're talking about the place far there where there's really no road and no power, right? So I think the question of how do we help countries strengthen their business environment is very, very important. I also think it goes beyond the refugee agenda. I mean, they need to improve their business environment regardless, right? And in this context, the Jordan Compact essentially refers to this notion that Jordan was given preferred access to the European market in exchange of granting a certain number of work permits to refugees. I think there's been quite a lot of analysis. So obviously, this is an experience that is still on the way. So one needs to be careful not to draw conclusions too early. But I think there's been quite a lot of analysis, including by CGD, by IRC, and others about what has worked less well. I think the conclusion is probably that this is an important model, that it is actually quite innovative and welcome to think not only in terms of aid in the traditional way, but also trade and opportunities for trade. But that this was essentially the result of a political decision and put together in a very, very rapid manner, and that in hindsight it would probably have been useful to spend a little bit more time in trying to figure out what exactly is the demand, where exactly are the opportunities. Now, having said that, once you've launched an initiative, it's always easier to retrofit it than to launch something, right? So I think the question as we speak is much more about, so how do you fine tune, what do you adjust, and so on, which is actually quite interesting. Whether we want to promote this systematically, I think on this sort of things you need to be a little bit practical, open-minded, and avoid the one-size-fits-all. I think we've learned some lessons. I think some countries have the potential to export to some markets, others have less of a potential, or in the case of others, yet there are other considerations that are anyway going to drive the decision. So I think we just need to be practical and pragmatic and see where it makes sense and where it makes less sense. I think on the question of trauma, it's difficult. It's difficult for several reasons, right? I mean, it's difficult because obviously an organization like ours has limited experience. So this is kind of new, which is always difficult, and at least for a large organization takes time to develop. I think the other reason is the numbers, right? If you're talking about, so I think the number by the Swedish Red Cross is that about 2/3 of the Syrians who have arrived in Sweden are in need of psychosocial, support, right? Now, if you're in Sweden, it's kind of doable, right? You have a number of professionals who can provide these services, and you have a relatively small population that needs to benefit from these services. But if you're in northern Uganda and you just got 1 million South Sudanese, how do you do this, right? And so I think what people are trying to figure out is, what alternative methods do you have or can you think of to deliver the sort of psychosocial services that are needed in an environment where you're not going to have a professional for every, 20 or 50 persons who is in need, right? And so I think there's both an issue of how does a large institution structure itself to respond, but there's also a question of what mechanisms exist to provide such services to very large population in an environment where there are very few professionals, where there can only be very few professionals. In terms of preparedness and climate change, so I like to make a distinction between refugees who are fleeing conflict, violence, persecution, and people who are moving because of climate change, right? Because what you see when people move into climate change, so you have the victims of natural disaster, right? The floods and so on. it's still a very different concept, right? So you leave during the flood, you come back, right? You may have experienced losses. They tend to be bricks and mortar losses. You haven't had the experience of seeing your neighbor turn on you and kill your kid in front of you, right? It's a very, very different experience. And moreover, your government doesn't think bad of you, right? Which is very different from a refugee situation, right? So I think what we see in terms of this displacement, that in some cases it tends to be long-lasting, in many cases it tends to be relatively short-term, and more calling for a brick-and-mortar type of response, right? Then you have the people who leave because of desertification, drought, changes in the conditions where they were growing, whatever it is that they were growing. If you think about it, it's not terribly different from the situation of an economic migrant, right? Because essentially what it means is your income is less than what it used to be or what you expected it to be. Whether it is less because of a climate change or because the prices for whatever it is that you are producing have collapsed, for you, the result is the same, right? But it is still a situation where you can plan for your departure, where you can plan where you're going to go, at which pace, you can sell whatever it is that you have as an asset. Once again, you haven't seen your neighbor turn on you. The politics are much simpler. So I think from our perspective, we understand the need to talk about climate refugees and so on, but it's fundamentally very different from the traditional refugees, right? In terms of the joint data center, so essentially the story behind that is that the World Bank and UNHCR have decided to establish a joint data center to make sure that we can have the sort of data that we need to make informed decision in terms of where to invest, but also that we can build the evidence on what works, what doesn't work, right? So this is something that was launched last summer. It is located in Copenhagen. We understand that the US is committed to provide support, which is very welcome. We're very grateful for it. I think the idea is not so much to have a one-shot thing, but it's really to try to strengthen our ability to collect data, but also change a little bit, once again, the mindset, so that we go from data which are driven by advocacy needs to data that are actually driven by the need to make investment decisions and allocation decisions, but also that we try to produce data that can be made public, right? Because our dream is that we would have lots of PhD students who would actually go to these data sets and figure out that there are lots of things that they can extract from this data set that could inform all the conversation about what is the exact impact of these people on host communities, right? What is the exact policies that do work? And so if we can manage to make this data in an anonymized form, nobody wants to put the personal life stories of these people in the public domain, right? But if we could manage to make this data public, then we would hope that lots of people like you could then do some research, including on things that I'm unable to conceive, that would actually help us provide better advice to the government in host countries. Okay, you choose. 1, 2, 3, 4.
So you mentioned, I'm Walker White, I'm a first-year IDPs student. You mentioned on one of your slides, like buying down interest rates for projects. How much of that is focused on giving to government level or country level entities versus nonprofits and private sector solutions to some of the problems you're facing in these crises?
So let me respond very quickly to this one. We still work with government. And as I discussed before, for us, the big stake is to change the government policy, right? So for example, we work in Ethiopia. And one of the things the government of Ethiopia has recently done is change their refugee law, which means that people are no longer obliged to live in refugee camps, but have the possibility to get out of refugee camps, to access the job market like any other foreigner, to access national services and so on. And from our perspective, this is great, right? And this is much more important than many of the other things we could have done, right? Because once people have opportunities, they're adults, right? I mean, they will take advantage of these opportunities in many, many different ways, right? Now, in some cases, When we talk to the government about the way to implement projects, we may rely on non-governmental partners and CSOs and the like. But fundamentally, our objective is to try and work with the government to improve the policy environment where refugees are living and to improve the institutional capacity to actually enforce and implement the regulations. From now on, you go to the person who is closest to you.
Hi, my name is Courtney Roberts. I'm with the MAGP program. I got back from Georgia, which you probably know has a protracted IDP situation of 280,000 IDPs and growing, and also they do host other refugees. And I'm wondering, one of the things that came from that trip is that they're not very much or not very well integrated in their communities, but also they're not utilized for conflict resolution. And is there any sort of projects or opportunities to more effectively include these populations to resolve protracted conflicts?
So conflict resolution obviously belongs to agencies that is not the World Bank. Therefore, I'm going to skip the question. But what I wanted to maybe discuss very briefly is the notion of IDPs, right? Internally displaced persons. So it's a very large group that includes people who are in displacement in the middle of Syria as we speak now, people in Yemen who are being bombed as we speak now and live in displacement, and people in Georgia and Colombia who've been in displacement for a long time in an environment that's otherwise, stable, that has decent rates of economic growth, solid institutions, and so on, right? So we have a huge spectrum, and I think it's important to avoid, when we talk about IDPs, to kind of really figure out which ones or which types we're talking about, right? One of my colleagues from a non-governmental organizations was asking me, to which extent does it help people to be categorized as IDPs? And especially when it is in protracted situations. When do you stop being an IDP? And does the fact that you carry this label IDP help you? Or does it actually harm you, right? Does it provide you with more support and opportunities? Or does it actually provide you with less opportunities and with some form of stigma or less access or otherwise, right? And I think it obviously depends, country by country. But if we think about the welfare of the individual as our guiding principle, then the question is really, how long do we need to consider people as IDPs, considering that in many cases people were living from a village to a city and would have probably left their village anyway, even if there had been no violence, obviously under far, far less traumatic circumstances and much better circumstances. And when is it that being labeled an IDP is useful, and when it is that being labeled an IDP is actually becoming part of the problem, right? So I'm thinking about a country where if you're an IDP, you're supposed to send your kids to an IDP school. Presumably, this is not the best school in the country.
Hi, Jake Stockman, second-year student here. My question has to do with whether refugees wind up in camps versus urban settings, what factors shape that, and what efforts the bank is doing in that resettlement pattern.
So I think there are different elements in the question, right? So first, the whole question of what makes people move. Why are you moving and am I not moving? Right? What's the difference between us? What makes you move today rather than yesterday? All these questions are actually fairly poorly documented, right? Beyond the anecdotal evidence of family X or family Y, right? But we still have very, very little that would help us understand who is actually moving in a community, why people are moving at a certain time, what are the factors that cause these things, right? I personally would think that, with all the stuff that's happening on the big data front, there's probably a lot we can mine, right? Think about the Syrian refugees walking through Europe. Story goes that they were all trying to plug their cell phone, right, while walking. Presumably it was not to play computer games, right? Presumably it was because they were using this to communicate and to get information and so on. So if someone could actually look at this data and try to figure out, what are the patterns, what are the causes and so on, I think that would help tremendously. So therefore what I'm trying to say is, the answer is we don't really know, right? So the second point is, it also depends on what the policy is of the receiving government and of the international community. So in some places, people are very keen on setting up camps. In other places, the last thing they want to see is camps, right? So think about the Syrian refugees and the different responses by Jordan and Lebanon. One trying to rely on camps, at least initially, the other one trying to avoid camps. So part of it has to do with how we react, right? And then part of it has to do about who these people are, right? So the people who will typically go to the city tend to be the ones who feel that they could fare well in cities. The people who feel that they will most likely have to remain dependent on humanitarian assistance tend to remain close to wherever it is delivered, which typically takes the form of a camp or a camp-like a setting, right? But it also depends on whether you live with a little bit of money, whether you have a sick kid who needs a certain type of health care that can only be obtained in a certain city, whether your job is of this, of that nature, right? Once again, it's an area where there's very, very little in terms of evidence.
One more question. If anybody has one burning question, okay.
Hi, my name is Yvonne Powers. I'm a second-year student studying international development. Thanks for your talk. I was wondering, beyond these two financing mechanisms, the GCFF and the sub-window, is the bank incorporating a kind of refugee framework into its other lending projects?
Yes. What's very interesting in the life of what's very interesting in a large organization, right? And I'm just going to try maybe to be a little bit real life-ish. So whenever we go with a project, we have a decision meeting, right? The decision meeting is chaired typically by what we call the country director. Now imagine a country director that chairs a decision meeting on refugees on Tuesday and chairs a decision meeting on education on Thursday. Well, what was discussed on Tuesday is still in the back of her mind, right? And so she's going to ask the education colleagues, oh, by the way, what about refugees, right? And that changes a little bit the way we think about things, right? When we talk to the Ministry of Finance, say, by the way, there's this money for refugees, we have a conversation with them on this, right? And that's going to continue in the next time we see him, and the time after, and so on and so forth, right? So I think part of it is the refugees themselves, the projects themselves, and the sub-window or the GCFF. But because we have these conversations, then gradually, as an organization, we absorb this as an issue of interest and of relevance that is then carried through all the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Please join me once again in thanking Mr. Devictor for sharing his time and his insights. And that concludes our roundtable for today and for the semester. So we will have 4 more talks next semester, which will be very exciting, and we'll be sharing those as soon as we have them. Of your day and rest of your semester.
If I can add something, because your colleague was asking me earlier, this is an exhilarating and extremely gratifying area to work on. So whether it's at the World Bank, at State Department, or anywhere else, it's a great thing to do.